We know that from polls prior to the Olympics, many of the Japanese population didn't want the Games to take place. It's really interesting because Tokyo is now in its fourth state of emergency. And I think by comparison, if you look at the numbers around the pandemic in Tokyo compared to somewhere like, for example, London, the situation here has actually been serious, much more serious. And so I think what we can conclude is that the Japanese people and the Japanese government in general have been very cautious in the way that they've dealt with the virus. So there was a great deal of resentment there, but at the same time, obviously, for a country that has spent the best part of 10 years preparing for this, there was a lot of anticipation and there was a certain degree of excitement too. I know a lot of people watched on TV. There were people watching the fireworks. So I think mixed emotions, but obviously big concern about the pandemic.
So COVID, the most obvious challenge for the Games, but its controversies have been much wider than that.
It's really starting from day one. The Games, when it was initially conceived of in 2011 following the tsunami and the Fukushima disaster, and Shinzo Abe took over as Prime Minister in 2012. And the political tone, the political nature of the Games, I think, began to ramp up at that point. And if we fast forward and up to now, Abe had to resign last August, so this followed on, obviously, from the postponing of the Games last summer. But in addition to that, there have been issues around gender discrimination. There have been issues around the treatment of different groups in Japan. And so it's actually been quite controversial. I think in some ways, Japan has actually struck lucky because most of the world has been looking at the pandemic rather than focusing on some of these domestic issues related to the Games that it has been grappling with.
And we've also had sponsors deciding to stay away, as well as uncertainty about whether the Games would even go ahead. So how has all this affected the Olympic brand?
The observation about sponsors is an interesting one because we know that, for example, Toyota has perhaps been the highest profile sponsor to step back. Toyota is still activating its deal worldwide, but is not showing TV ads related to the Olympics in Japan. And I think obviously there's a big concern about this being a super spreader event. And if it is to be a super spreader event, how will that reflect upon a sponsor? And I think there's also something too for Toyota in terms of social solidarity. But for the IOC and the Olympics itself, this is a tough one. There's a great deal of cynicism, particularly in the West, around the Olympics and the costs that it imposes upon countries. And I'm thinking particularly here of financial costs. But I think what the pandemic has done is to create this notion that there is also a health cost or a sociocultural cost as well. And I'm not sure so far that the IOC and the Olympics have handled this particularly well. And I think it's got a lot of work to do over the next 2 weeks to ensure trust, to show empathy, to demonstrate to a global audience that this is an organisation that really does care about the host nations in which it stages these events.
And you mentioned the financial cost. This is a Games that's gone way over budget. Why would any country want to bid to host the Games again?
That's actually a great question, because if you look at all of the scientific research around Olympic Games hosting, the benefits at best are marginal. There is a consensus that it costs more than the benefits that you're actually going to generate in most cases. And so I think what you're looking towards is you're looking towards changing perceptions of a nation, enhancing nation brand, building reputation, projecting soft power, and perhaps effecting internal changes. And I know in Japan's case, one of the things that the Japanese government is trying to do is to change Japanese culture and become more outward looking and engaged with the world. So I think it's in those more intangible areas possibly where you're going to see the most significant benefits.
We've just been looking at pictures of demonstrations happening outside the opening ceremony, but now the Games have started, do you think the country will get behind them?
I mean, I do think some of the coverage around protests outside the Games venues is a little disingenuous, because as the ceremony was taking place today, I thought back to London 2012, and obviously I was in Britain at that time. There were protests then on the opening day of the Games, so this is something that typically happens. But I do think that there are genuine concerns in Japan, and this is not something that's just happened over a day or a week or a month. This has been sustained over the last 14, 15, 16 months. As we know, the pandemic has been hugely destructive in lots of different ways. people are genuinely concerned about their health and well-being. And I think it's vital, not just for the Japanese government, but also for the IOC and for other stakeholders who are there in Tokyo to let these people be heard and for them to demonstrate that they are being heard and that measures are being taken to ensure that the city remains as safe as possible.
Simon Chadwick from Lyon Business School. It's great to get your thoughts today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.